The crystalline arena of Zephyria Prime hummed with anticipation as representatives from 47 different species gathered in the floating Colosseum. The ancient ritual of Kethmoran, the trial of champions, hadn't been invoked in over 3 centuries, but the upstart species calling themselves humans had somehow earned the right to participate in the Galactic Council through combat. Ambassador Veltar of the Zephyrian Empire adjusted his ceremonial robes, his 4 eyes gleaming with barely contained amusement. The humans had been spacefaring for less than 200 rotations, practically infants compared to civilizations that had mastered the stars for millennia. Yet here they were, demanding representation based on some obscure legal precedent their diplomat had discovered in the Council's founding documents. "This will be over quickly," Veltar murmured to his aide, a younger Zephyrian whose scales still bore the bright hues of youth. "The Thrakari champion alone has won 12 consecutive Kethmoran trials. Their warrior caste has been bred for combat for 10,000 years. The aide nodded nervously. "But Ambassador, the human representative, there's something unusual about him." Veltar followed his aide's gaze to the human section of the arena. The human diplomat, a middle-aged male with graying hair and tired eyes, sat slumped in his chair, occasionally glancing at what appeared to be a primitive datapad. He looked more like a bureaucrat than a warrior. "That's their champion?" Veltar laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "I've seen more intimidating creatures in a Centaurian petting zoo." Across the arena, the Thrakari delegation presented a vastly different sight. Their champion, Warlord Grixmoth, stood nearly 3 meters tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming with bioengineered enhancements. Razor-sharp claws extended from his forearms and his mandibles clicked in anticipation. The Thrakari had never lost a trial of champions. Their warrior culture considered defeat worse than death. The arena's central platform descended from the dome above, a perfect circle of adaptive matter that would reshape itself based on the combatants' preferred fighting conditions. Ancient holographic projectors created the traditional combat environment, a barren landscape under twin suns, with scattered rocky outcroppings for tactical advantage. "Let the Kethmoran commence," boomed the voice of the Arbiter, a being so old that his species had transcended physical form millennia ago. "Warlord Grixmoth of the Thrakari hegemony, approach the Circle of Honor." The Thrakari champion leaped from his platform, landing on the arena floor with a thunderous impact that cracked the crystalline surface. He performed the ritual war dance of his people, his movements a deadly ballet of striking limbs and snapping mandibles. The crowd roared its approval. Many had wagered heavily on the outcome, and the odds heavily favored the experienced warrior. Thomas Chen of the Human Federation approached the Circle of Honor. The human stood slowly, stretching like someone who had been sitting too long at a desk. He walked, not strode, not marched, simply walked, toward the arena floor. Several alien spectators exchanged confused glances. Where was the pre-battle ritual? The display of strength? The psychological warfare? Thomas Chen stepped onto the platform and immediately yawned. It wasn't a small, polite yawn. It was the kind of deep, bone-weary yawn that comes after a long day of tedious meetings and bureaucratic paperwork. He covered his mouth with the back of his hand and blinked slowly, like someone fighting off sleep. The arena fell silent. Even Grixmoth stopped his war dance, confused by this unprecedented display of boredom. Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "Are we doing this now? Because I have a conference call with the Terran Agriculture Council in about 20 minutes, and I really need to wrap this up." Grixmoth's mandibles clicked furiously. In the ancient Thrakari tongue, he roared his challenge. "Human, you dare show such disrespect to the sacred Kethmoran? I shall feast on your bones and use your skull as a drinking vessel." Thomas pulled out his datapad and checked something. "Yeah, okay, look. I've been reading the rules during the opening ceremony, and there's actually a subsection here." He squinted at the screen. "Article 47, Clause 12, subsection C. It says that any champion may invoke immediate victory by demonstrating overwhelming superiority without engaging in combat." The Arbiter's voice held a note of confusion. "That provision hasn't been used in over 5,000 years, yeah, I know." Thomas scrolled through his notes. "But it's still valid. So here's the thing, Griximoth, may I call you Grix? You're operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about human capabilities." The Thrakari warrior lunged forward, covering half the distance to the human in a single bound. claws extended for a killing strike. Thomas sighed and raised his left hand. Grixamoth stopped mid-air, suspended 3 feet off the ground by an invisible force. His claws scraped uselessly at nothing. His legs kicked frantically, but he remained frozen in place like an insect trapped in amber. "See, this is exactly the kind of thing I was hoping to avoid," Thomas said, lowering his hand and causing the Thrakari champion to settle gently onto the ground, still unable to move. "Everyone always assumes humans got into space through technology or luck or whatever. But the thing is," he gestured casually, and Grixmoth's weapons, built into his very biology, simply stopped working. The razor edges became dull, the bio-enhancements shut down. The combat instincts bred into his genetic code went silent. "We didn't develop faster than light travel," Thomas continued, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher explaining something to a slow student. "We developed psionics, about 300 years ago, give or take. Took us another century to figure out how to use it for space travel, but the military applications, well, those came pretty quickly." The arena erupted in chaos. Representatives from dozens of species began shouting questions, demands, threats. Several delegations moved toward the exits. Species that had been planning to subjugate or exploit humanity were suddenly reconsidering their strategies. Thomas glanced at his datapad again. "Anyway, I'm claiming victory under Article 47. Grixmoth is unharmed but completely neutralized, demonstrating that human champions can end conflicts without violence when necessary." He looked up at the Arbiter's projected form. "That should satisfy the requirements for council membership, right?" The Arbiter was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of eons. "In 500,000 years of observing Kethmoran trials, I have never seen such a display. The human champion has indeed demonstrated overwhelming superiority without causing harm to his opponent. The trial is concluded." Thomas nodded and released his hold on Grixmoth, who collapsed to his knees, staring up at the human with something approaching religious awe. "Great," Thomas said, already heading toward the exit. "I'll have our diplomatic corps send over the paperwork for our council seat. Oh, and Grix? No hard feelings. Your people fight with honor. It's just that we've moved beyond needing to fight at all." As he walked away, Thomas Chin, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Galactic Affairs, former high school physics teacher, and one of the most powerful psionics in human space, yawned again and checked his watch. The conference call with the Agriculture Council was in 15 minutes, and they were discussing the new grain subsidies for the Martian colonies. Some battles, he reflected, were harder to win than others,